My talk is Shockwaves from Stonewall. It's gay liberation in Michigan. It's a talk that just kind of evolves every time I give it, depending on the audience and depending on some new things that I might discover. It kind of had its origins in a feature article in Between the Lines newspaper, which I did for the 50th anniversary of Stonewall in 2019. Over the years, as I'm working on various research projects, including my book, there's just kind of new things that emerge and that I discover, that I think about in new ways. As part of my talk, I'll talk a little bit about process, because I think it's really important for us to understand how we get at history and how we understand history, particularly of communities that are often marginalized and, certainly until 1969, but even to the current day, where people are forced to remain hidden or choose to remain hidden. Much of my research is on Southeast Michigan, but I've done research on Ann Arbor, on Flint, on Lansing, and I've done bits and pieces of West Michigan, so I've tried to incorporate some of those into the talk tonight. As to set the stage, I want to kind of go back way before Stonewall to the 1950s and talk a little bit about the national scene and the environment nationally. So most of us are familiar with the Red Scare. The last 25 or 30 years, historians have also come to understand the 1940s, 50s as a period of the Lavender Scare, where people were targeted with witch hunts, mainly in the federal government. There was a study that the US Senate conducted that said that one homosexual could infect an entire office, and more people lost their jobs for homosexuality during the Lavender Scare than lost their jobs for being alleged communists during the Red Scare. And some of the people, Joe McCarthy and Roy Cohn, pictured here, were in both scares. And this showed itself locally, mainly because homosexuality was criminalized. It was considered a mental illness, and in most denominations it was considered a sin and against scripture. So that showed itself, and people were targeted for arrests. Police in Detroit, for instance, would plan other undercover officers who would go into gay bars. One of the most famous arrests was Prophet Jones, who was a religious leader in Detroit, who had an undercover officer planted in his flock. Singer Johnny Ray, who was kind of the big popular singer between Frank Sinatra and Elvis, was actually arrested twice in Detroit, one in '51 and one in '59, for soliciting an undercover officer. And it kind of had a detrimental effect on his career. This also showed itself on college campuses. There were a number of witch hunts on college campuses where people who we would now put under the umbrella LGBTQ, began to meet each other and find themselves and kind of create a sense of identity. So there are major crackdowns at the University of Michigan, at Michigan State. There's other instances at Central Michigan and at Wayne. These two documents, one is, the one on the left is a police report that was in the president's papers at Michigan State. The names are redacted because of federal student records laws, so that I could have access to it. But basically, a student was arrested and then forced to name names. So the police wanted to know all of the friends and where they met them. The other article is by Tom Hayden, who is famous as a founder of SDS. And he was editor of the Michigan Daily at U of M in the early 1960s, when there was a major crackdown there that received wide publicity. Not to make things too bleak, though, people were able to find themselves and able to forge networks and communities in this time period most prominently for people who were white in gay and lesbian bars. And there were bars such as the Silver Dollar in Boston, Dixie's in New Orleans, the Black Cat in San Francisco, the Acme Bar in San Antonio, and the Scenic Bar in Toledo, which was popular for Detroiters because they would sell something called 3-2 beer. It was like a lower alcohol beer. So you could drink that at 19, so a lot of Detroiters would go down to Toledo. And then here in Michigan, there was a 1011 in Detroit. There was a rough lesbian bar called the Palais, known as the Pit in Detroit, the Hotel Wentworth Bar in Lansing, the State Bar in Flint, and here in Saugatuck, or across the way in Saugatuck, the Blue Tempo was a popular gay bar. Now, for African Americans who often were discriminated against and couldn't have access to the drinking establishments in the same way that whites did, they found their own ways to forge community, most prominently with house parties. These individuals here, there's Ruth Ellis and Babe Franklin. They were a couple starting in the 1940s, and the 40s, 50s, and 60s. They would hold house parties in their home on Oakland Avenue in Detroit. Ruth Ellis was a printer, so she was a private business person, so she had kind of the economic independence to be able to do this. And so people from all over Detroit in the metro area, and then even from Flint and Saginaw would come down to Detroit to be part of these African American house parties. And then there was also this phenomena in Detroit where female impersonation and drag in the African American community was especially popular and provided kind of a safe space for people who were under the umbrella of queer could have a livelihood and could perform and express themselves. And some of these, the Michigan Chronicle covered it, Jet Magazine covered it, so it was a surprisingly visible realm of LGBTQ life at the time. I mentioned kind of points of discovery. These are a couple photographs that were up for sale on eBay a few years ago, and my husband and I happened to snag them. They show the Detroit Gay Ball of 1946. Now, we don't know much about these, except you can kind of read that that there's an audience, there are people paying tips, they've signed their stage names, so there's like a Lena Horne here. And so it's some glimpse, it's a fragment, it's something not to be denied. And Lena Horne happened to be mentioned when I interviewed a man 2 years ago named Abba Elethea, who was active in the gay world of Detroit starting in the 1940s and 50s. He's now approaching 90 and had amazing memories of meeting Ruth Ellis, and Ruth Ellis telling his mother that he thought that her son was probably a sissy, at which point he kicked Ruth Ellis in the shins, but then later became one of the people to go to her house parties. But he mentioned specifically Lena Horne. He mentioned trying to go to the Club Vogue underage and trying to peek in and see these impersonators on stage. So there's this connection for real individuals. So the 1950s nationally were also kind of the first point where people who might fall under today's umbrella of transgender showed themselves. This is Christine Jorgensen, who in 1953 famously went to Denmark to have a sex change, what might be called an affirmation surgery now. And she made headlines. She was a national sensation. And there were ways in which she was not spurned in the ways that people who were homosexual would be spurned. In some ways, she was seen as kind of a scientific fascination. And she also established a career as a nightclub performer and performed at a bar in Dearborn called the Gay Haven. I interviewed a local activist named Grace Bacon, who formed an organization in Flint. I'll talk about in a bit, but she remembers Christine Jorgensen and reading about Christine Jorgensen when she was 12 years old, and just what opened up inside her in terms of identifying with Christine. So then there's kind of the first kind of seeds of political pushback and activism, people coming together to organize. In the 1950s, a group of small organizations that historians called the homophile movement began to be formed, usually in larger cities. So the Mattachine Society was started in Los Angeles in 1950 and 51. A couple years later, One Magazine was started in 1953 by some people who were originally from Southeast Michigan. The Daughters of Bilitis was started in 1955. And sometimes they're disparaged as being assimilationist and kind of pushing for reform rather than revolution. And yet for the 1950s, at a time when it was the Lavender Scare and people could lose their job, they could lose their homes, they could lose, if they were heterosexually married and had children, they could lose their children. There were great risks. So even kind of this inching forward and trying to organize and trying to bring people together, publish magazines, and change people's minds was significant. The second photo on the right shows some picketing of Independence Hall. So starting in the 1950s, people started being a little more proactive and pushing for political change there. And this showed itself in Michigan as well. There was a chapter of the Mattachine Society that was started in Detroit in 1958 by Hal Lawson and David Brewer and their friend Jerry Moore. They were all three graduates of Wayne State University. And this chapter, they were very fearful. The initial meeting, they had two sets of minutes, one using real names, one using pseudonyms, because they were afraid of being caught and infiltrated. And though they managed to meet and last for 17 months, and they published a newsletter, and they hosted out-of-town guests, and they had some outreach to area clergy, they were just too fearful. So they disbanded in March of 1960, and then there were no organizations in Michigan, formal organizations, until 1965, when a Grosse Pointe travel agent named Chet Sampson started a group called One in Detroit. So One was mainly a magazine in Los Angeles, but it established chapters of One Incorporated, the publisher of One magazine, in both Detroit and Chicago. And Detroit was probably the most vibrant of these organizations. He was a former school teacher. He owned a travel agency, so he was able to provide a space for them to meet. And it lasted until 1977. The one document that I love to show, and I don't know how well you can see it, it's from the Labadie collection at the University of Michigan, and it is a flyer for a gay day at Cedar Point in June of 1969, which is 2 weeks before Stonewall.
Wow.
So they were already having gay days at Cedar Point, if you've heard about those, in 1969. And then there's Stonewall. So Stonewall is kind of seen as kind of this major pivot moment. What Stonewall was a series of pushbacks against police oppression, police entrapment and raids of a unlicensed bar in Greenwich Village in New York called the Stonewall Inn. So it precipitated 3 or 4 nights of rioting with, up to 2,000 people taking to the streets to, challenge the police's routine tactics of arresting people. And there had not been that level of pushback before. There had been pushback, but not that level. It was also in New York, the media capital of the country, so word got out. And it also inspired a new wave and a new kind of activism that has come to be understood as gay liberation. So within a week or two, they started saying, we need to have a meeting, we need to form organizations, and there's a new generation who've been kind of brought up and kind of influenced by the anti-war movement, the free speech movement, the women's movement, the Black Power movement, and the Black Civil Rights movement. And so they thought it was time for queer people, gay people, lesbian people to come together and push back too. And this was a change from the homophile organizations that came before, in part because it was very in your face. It was much more militant. Many of these people were seeking revolution, not reform. So it was much more militant. It was also a much more mass movement. So it wasn't restricted to kind of the largest cities, but kind of spread across the country in ways that we had not experienced before. Some of this is generational. And one of the key things, two of the key things they did was change the definition of coming out. Rather than coming out into the gay world, you would be coming out to the world, to your families, workplace, fellow students, and so forth. So visibility was very important. And then they also succeeded in getting the American Psychiatric Association to reverse its categorizing of homosexuality as a mental illness. So this is a delightful cover from the Chicago Gay Crusaders saying 20 million gay people are suddenly cured because they had changed their policy and taken this definition, this diagnosis out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So these are kind of key things nationally that took place. And then it, as I said, it spread across the country, including in Michigan, and first of all in Metro Detroit with the founding of the Detroit Gay Liberation Front in January of 1970. And this is where I let some of the people who were involved speak for themselves. Jim Toy was one of the founders of the Detroit Gay Liberation Front, and this is an excerpt from an interview that he did that's in an online forum called Outspoken: Oral History from LGBTQ Pioneers. Here's Jim Toy.
I continue to work at St. Joseph's Episcopal Church, and part of my job, along with having a music program, was to type up every weekend the worship bulletin, which was distributed at worship services on Sunday morning. I'm typing in December of 1969, and on the calendar I see a penciled note that says gay meeting, January something 1970. I scratched my head metaphorically, went to the priest, this is radical times, radical vocabulary, and said to him, Daddy-o, which is what we called him, what is this gay meeting thing? He said, well, I don't know. One of the guys in the draft resistance group said, could we have a gay meeting here? And I said, well, whatever it is, if we can't have a gay meeting at this God box, which is what the term we use to refer to the church, we might as well shut it down. I said, thank you. From the depths of my closet, I kept on typing. I finished the typing, drove back to Ann Arbor. I was a grad student in the music school. I had cracked open my closet door enough to go down to the gay bar in downtown Ann Arbor. And so that night I went down there, and there's my good buddy John. And I said to John, there's something very strange going on at the God box. And he said, what? I said, a gay meeting. And he said, a what? A gay meeting. What's that? I didn't know, and he didn't know. There never had been in Michigan up to that time an open, above ground, advertised, quote, gay meeting. My friend John and I, having seen notice of, quote, a gay meeting at St. Joseph's Episcopal Church, my term for it is ambivalated. We ambivalated for a month about whether or not we were going to go. And the night before the meeting, January 1970, we got together at the Flame Bar, the gay bar in Ann Arbor. Are we going to go to this meeting or not? and we looked at each other and said, "Ooh, if we go to this meeting, it means we're gay." Well, the next day, we got into John's car and drove into Detroit to the meeting. And that marked our coming out to ourselves, our coming out to each other, and our coming out to the other people at the meeting. There were perhaps a dozen women and men at the meeting. We talked for hours. We decided to keep on meeting and to refer to ourselves as the Detroit Gay Liberation Movement,
which was soon changed to Gay Liberation Front. And among their first protests was actually against the Episcopal Diocese, because the bishop at the time told the church to kick them out. So they began meeting in one of the congregants' homes, but they had a protest of the diocesan convention in November 1970 and demanded to speak at the closing session, and the bishop had the convention gaveled to a close, so they never got to speak. But they did kind of make some other kinds of headway, one of which was starting the Gay Liberator newspaper. Notice the Baby New Year 71 with the bandolier of bullets, so some of the people were very radical in their thinking. They also were protesting against the police and police entrapment, so they were kind of very mindful of the ways in which queer people had been targeted by society. So that was going on in Detroit. Jim Toy, as a grad student in Ann Arbor, also had a hand in forming the Gay Liberation Front of Ann Arbor, which almost immediately became in conflict with the highest echelons of the university's administration. President Robin Fleming refused to let them hold a gay conference on campus of various organizations, saying that they didn't have the expertise to speak themselves. It wouldn't be an academic conference, and basically the legislature wouldn't like it. So they went head to head with the university. It made headlines, and eventually someone who was involved in student government gave them keys to the student activities building, and they held the conference anyway. Within a year and a half, they had made inroads within the university, so that Jim Toy and Cyndi Gair were hired as human sexuality advocates to become the first kind of specifically funded, university-funded office with paid employees to serve LGBTQ plus students on campus. So this was pioneering in terms of Ann Arbor and what Ann Arbor was able to do. So I'm going to jump back a minute nationally and back in New York in terms of what was happening with trans populations. Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera were both transvestites, would be what they called themselves, or street queens. They formed an organization called STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, to serve LGBTQ and specifically trans homeless youth and sex workers. And this was the first kind of organization of this kind in the country, and had some ripples. There was actually a STAR chapter that was formed in Ann Arbor, and the Gay Liberator kind of publicized it, that this had started. And one of the members, who we would consider cisgender now, kind of used STAR as an example of just kind of reaching too far, and he didn't think that gay libs should be embracing this. And one of the other participants in gay liberation in Detroit, A. Michael Warner, who also went by Sabina, wrote an article in protest. And then she, it's tricky because they use both names, wrote a piece, a longer feature article about what it meant for them to be transgender. So this is 1971, 1972, at a time when we don't necessarily think that trans stuff was on the radar. But it was, and it was in a couple other ways as well. So there was an effort in the state legislature to repeal the state sodomy law. It was called the Traxler Bill. And it would have, like Illinois had done, it would have repealed laws against homosexual activity. But it didn't have anything about cross-dressing, and the gay activists from around the state converged on the state capitol protesting the fact that they didn't have this provision. So they were opposed to the Traxler Bill. So the very first protest in Michigan at the state capitol had to do with transgender rights. And then the Gay Liberation Front in Ann Arbor also picketed the Flame Bar because they wouldn't let lesbians in and they wouldn't let people who were cross-dressing in. So it was definitely in the mix. The tricky part is we have much less evidence about what was going on among those folks than we do non-trans people. So the other thing that was happening is gay liberation was kind of laying the groundwork on various campuses across the state. This included Central Michigan, included Eastern Michigan. There was a gay pit session that was held at Grand Valley State. Western Michigan had a chapter of the Gay Liberation Front that formed. So campuses became kind of a volatile place for activism to start. Including at MSU, I mentioned U of M. MSU had a gay liberation movement that formed in April of 1970. In 1972, they wanted to hang a banner for Gay Pride Week over the Abbott Street entrance, if you know MSU's campus, but Vice President Breslin said, no, absolutely not. So they were denied it, but they went through judicial channels on campus, and so for 1973, they were able to hang the banner over the Abbott Street entrance. It was promptly stolen, and they had a replacement ready, and sentries ready to guard it while it was up the rest of the Pride Week. There was also a demonstration in May of '72 that was against the war in Vietnam. President Nixon had done some escalating of the conflict at that point. And some MSU gay lib folks were on Grand River, and one of them, Don Goddard, pretended to drop his contact. So he was like on the pavement, scrouching around, and then his friends were all kind of coming in and scrouching around and pretending to try to look for his contact, and then they sat down. And then all these other people around them sat down. And they had a major sit-in that closed down Grand River for 3 days. And the gay part of that story is often overlooked, and yet we do have this photo of a Michigan State police trooper resting against spray-painted gay power. So there's, besides the oral histories of it, there's other kinds of evidence of it. Wayne State also had a gay liberation front that started in November 1971, holding meetings and having articles published in the South End for it. One of the major things that they did, aside holding dances, and I should say, the very first photo that I showed was a bunch of people getting ready for a gay pride dance or gay dance at Wayne State in 1972. So it just kind of gives us a lens. So this is a fruit cart that was set up outside Wayne State on the plaza to sell gay fruit to raise money for Christopher Street, Detroit, 72, which was the first Pride celebration in Michigan. It was held in 1972. It was organized by a group called the Michigan Gay Confederation. It's what Isabel and I did our comic book about, and I have copies for folks who might like a copy today. So what was it? It was a series of events that included a march down Woodward, confined to a single lane, in the rain. It's kind of cold that day. With a rally at what was then Kennedy Square, was this kind of plaza that no longer exists, that had been a site of many public protests. And Susan Swope was the only lesbian speaker there. She was in the midst of separating from her husband. She had discovered she was lesbian and becoming involved in the women's movement and the gay movement. And this is a little bit of her account of remembering that day that she did in an oral history interview that I did with her in Pennsylvania.
I remember when we were planning this march, I delivered a speech. And I remember as I was anticipating giving this speech, thinking, you know, this speech could be on TV. And Michael's parents could see me on TV. And that's how Michael's parents would find out that I'm a lesbian. But I thought, you know, I just have to do it. It's important. And if that happens, it happens. And I remember standing up there and delivering that speech and being really nervous. But, of course, in the event, what got on TV was the drag queens. That's who always gets on TV when you have a gay march.
And lo and behold, there's photos of the drag queens riding on the hood of a 1964 Ford Galaxy at the front of the parade. Why they got on TV was at some point, midpoint in the parade, the driver of the car slammed on the brakes and all 4 drag queens fell to the pavement. And that's what went on TV. That's what the news publicized, and it's written in Greg Camp's diary about it. So it was very frustrating that all these people were coming together and, you know, the local news media was kind of making a joke of it. So Ken Dudley, Susan Swope was the only lesbian to speak. Ken Dudley was the only African American to speak. He had been involved in the protest against the Episcopal Church. He'd been long an activist. The Gay Liberator published their speeches. He passed away from AIDS in 1991, so there's kind of little of his voice that can help inform the story, except for his speech. Zaire Kwabena, who used to go by Curtis Lipscomb, is president of LGBT Detroit, a major organization in Detroit, and he is shown here kind of reenacting Ken Dudley's speech.
There are many black gays who are not marching with us today. That may be explained in part by the idea that black gay people march every day. If not by virtue of their gayness, then surely by virtue of their blackness. The black lesbian, for many, has been a symbol of the epitome of the struggle for human liberation in this society. The opposition to her right to self-expression and basic human rights are awesome. The black gay man, or queen, has within his multifaceted image the determination to demonstrate to everyone who sees him that in this decaying system of third world genocide, sexism, and capitalist exploitation, that he is going to make it, no matter what the odds. And the odds are great. Yes, black gays are entrapped just like white gays, but no more often, or are we? When we as individual black gays stand in front of the traffic court judge, we receive the same justice and or injustice. Or do we? Once busted for a gay offense, are we then busted for being black in America? Those of us who are marching here today, and those of us who march every day, know deep in our hearts that all anti-gay laws must not be reformed, but repealed. And as black gays, we must all know that this exploitive system must also be repealed.
So there was a dance held that evening at the Unitarian Church on Cass Avenue that drew several hundred people. And then the next day there was a gay be-in, a big picnic in Palmer Park. And I love this photo, one, because they're all wearing the Come Out in Detroit t-shirts that I love, but it shows the presence of lesbians. Oftentimes when I would interview gay men, they would say, well, there were no lesbians involved. And here's clear evidence that, no, actually, they were. You were just busy doing other things. Another strand I want to mention about Gay Lib, Gay Lib and the Gay Liberation Front in Detroit formed the basis of the Metropolitan Community Church of Detroit. It started as the Christian caucus of the Gay Liberation Front that met in an activist named John Kavanaugh's home. And then they had discovered a long-playing record, an LP. I can say LP, people will know what I mean in this audience, of a sermon by Reverend Troy Perry, who had started a church in LA in 1968, specifically targeted to the gay community. It's often called a gay church. In some ways it is a gay church, but they're also welcoming to all people. But so they became a formal church starting in 1972. Another aspect of, discovery, having kind of done deep dives into all kinds of records and materials, I had given access last fall to a scrapbook that the congregation started keeping when it started, and it's of their first 10 years. And this is a couple photos of a Holy Union, is what they called it, of two of the members in November 1972. So kind of this impulse to kind of unite and form unions, what would later become same-sex marriages, was certainly in the air and in the mix, even during Gay Liberation. So, and then it's really important to kind of talk about Ken Dudley's role in 1973 in forming the first organization that was specifically targeted to African-American LGBTQ people in Detroit, in response to a series of murders of black gay men who met someone at one of the black gay bars and then were later found murdered. So he and a woman named Ann Lewis started this organization. He wrote this article about it in the Gay Liberator. Other than this and some references to it, some listings, and knowing that it lasted at least until 75, I don't know anything about it. Ken Dudley's deceased. Ann Lewis has been elusive to me, though she showed up in the scrapbook. So I'm ever hopeful that some people might be able to witness some of these things. And then kind of folding out the Gay Lib period, there was a radio program that started in September 1973 on WDET called Gaily Speaking, that lasted until 1982 and became kind of a really important forum for people to access and network and find community. This was a medium that you could listen to if you were a teenager in your bedroom on a transistor radio, or if you were not out to whoever you lived with, you could go driving in your car and listen to it. So it was really, impactful. In times before the internet, this was kind of an access point. So, and then finally there were efforts to kind of seek elective office. So two members of Ann Arbor City Council were elected to City Council on the Human Rights Party in 1972. They were part of getting Gay Pride passed, Gay Pride Week passed in Ann Arbor. They were part of getting the ordinance passed, but they weren't out when they were elected. They came out while they were on council, and that was kind of big news. But Cassie Kozachenko in April of 1974 ran as an out lesbian and was elected to city council. So she's the first out candidate in the United States to ever be elected to office. So this is kind of the overview of Gay Lib. I want to kind of go into some of the reverb and what's happened in the years since and what kind of the legacy of Gay Lib is. So this is historian John D'Amelio, who has really been foundational in kind of establishing gay activist history and gay social history. And he kind of posits that after Gay Lib, the movement kind of split into two distinctive paths. One which was kind of lesbian and separatist and more focused on culture and sisterhood. And the other was primarily gay male and much more focused on rights and on sex. So for the women, the roots of this go back to the Second Congress to Unite Women that was held in New York City in 1970. There was a famous altercation with Betty Friedan, the president of the National Organization for Women, because she thought that lesbians involved in NOW would taint the organization. People would think that everybody involved in NOW was lesbian, and so she called them the Lavender Menace. So a bunch of activists, including Rita Mae Brown and some others, kind of infiltrated this auditorium where this session was going to be held. And then at one point the lights went out, and then the lights went back up, and there were women all over the auditorium who suddenly had Lavender Menace t-shirts on. And they demanded to have a hearing, and to their credit, they let them speak, they heard it, and began to make some inroads for lesbians within mainstream feminism. So it was kind of a major moment. Organizations that were specifically radical and lesbian, like the organization called the Radical Lesbians, formed at the University of Michigan and at Michigan State and around the country. And this is Cyndi Gair, who was the co-founder of the office with Jim Toy. This is Cyndi talking about her discovering the Radical Lesbians.
I walked into the room, and here I see this ring of women sitting around on the floor, and I look around, and there are, I could see one here, these women, these well-known women who I knew were in Radical Lesbians. So I knew that must be where I was. And I really freaked out. I sort of backed against the wall and felt like I was crawling around the edge of the room to sort of try and sit in the back. And everyone kind of turned around and smiled at me. A lot of them knew me. It's sort of like, aha. And I thought, no, wait, you don't understand. Well, it was this incredible night. And towards the end of the evening, I wasn't afraid of these people anymore. The other thing that happened was that I met this woman there. There was some party at Sue's house, her apartment. And all these women, it was the women who were in Radical Lesbians, and one by one they left, and I had decided that tonight was the night. I just loved her eyes, and I remember, they reminded me of my dog Snooch's eyes. And so I told her that night, I said, you just have the most amazing eyes. They remind me of my dogs. And I guess she took it pretty well. She said, oh, well, thank you. And she said, well, you can either, if you want, I can give you a ride home, or if you want to stay here the night, you can do that. I said, well, I'll stay here. And very casual, very cool. And then we got into bed. And I'm lying there, and we're sort of lying on opposite sides of the bed. She mumbled something to me, and I couldn't really hear her. And then it registered. She asked me if I needed a pillow or what. And so I thought, aha. I said, well, I mean, we could share one. So there, that was what did it. Then we just.
So then there was a rift within this Michigan Gay Coalition. They had started the march in '72. This occurred in early 1973, where some of the women who were involved pretty much got fed up and left. And this was a statement they published in a newspaper called Herself. The sisters from Ann Arbor, Lansing, East Lansing, Grand Rapids, and Detroit are unified in their strong convictions about protecting women's rights within this confederation. We are not going to allow the men to ignore our constituency. We can see no future in this confederation as long as sexist attitudes continue to exist. So this led to the flourishing of a rich lesbian culture in Detroit and other places in Michigan, including a group in Detroit called Soulful Sisters Rising. There was Her Shelf Bookstore in Highland Park. There was a women's bookstore in Ann Arbor. There was a publication that started in 1974 in Lansing called The Lesbian Connection, which was kind of an early version of online connectivity before there was such thing. There was a group in Ann Arbor called the Leaping Lesbian Collective that started a zine called The Leaping Lesbian that they would deliver in the trunks of their cars. In Kalamazoo, Lavender Morning was another publication. And then I'll note in Grand Rapids there was an organization called Aradia. The person here is Jer Van Syak, who became a noted lesbian filmmaker. She was one of the key early members of Aradia. They published a newsletter, they would hold gatherings and parties. And one of my favorite descriptions, they talk about, they would hold parties in their homes, and at one of the homes, the police were called because they were playing Nina Simone too loud. And then in Detroit, there was Poor Woman's Paradise, which was a coffee house for music and poetry. And these were all kind of leading into what emerged as the Michigan Women's Music Festival, which was started in 1976 by students at Central Michigan. It was first held in Mount Pleasant. It later moved to other parts in northern Michigan, and had events. There was a festival for the next 40 years. Not without controversy. There was a trans exclusion policy that in its later years caused a lot of distress, but it was also kind of formative for a lot of lesbians, not just in Michigan, but from around the US who would travel to Michigan to go to the festival. So then nationally, there's kind of the emergence of a formal national political movement with the founding of the National Gay Task Force in 1973. And in Detroit, this was kind of manifested with the approval by the voters of a city charter in 1973 that stipulated that people could not be discriminated based on sexual preference. So it was within the charter of the city of Detroit that there would not be discrimination. Now it took a few years then for the enacting ordinance to be passed in 1979, but it was kind of a key moment. And Brian McNaught was one of the first people to take advantage of it. Brian McNaught had been a columnist for the Michigan Catholic. He was the founder of a gay Catholic chapter of a gay Catholic organization called Dignity in Detroit. He came out in the Detroit News, and then his editor at the Michigan Catholic quickly stripped him of his column that he had been doing for the previous 4 years. So he went on a hunger strike, made national headlines, and achieved some kind of conciliatory response from the auxiliary bishop. So he's kind of a key figure in kind of moving away from kind of the radicalism of the early gay lib movement. And then his friend David Krumroy was also a kind of key person for kind of becoming more political, but also more commercial. He started a newspaper called Metro Gay News, which came into being after the Gay Liberator folded, which is much more kind of mainstream and diverse in terms of its coverage, not just leftist politics, but the bar scene and different organizations. And then David Krumroy was also involved in starting a group called the Association of Suburban People, which was kind of the largest, most impactful organization in Metro Detroit for LGBTQ people after Gay Lib. Neither Detroit or gay is mentioned in the name of their organization, but they were around for a good 12 years and were kind of a key organization. Then in 1977 comes Anita Bryant. So Anita Bryant was a nationally known singer. She was also the spokesperson for the Florida Citrus Council. And in June of 1977, she succeeded in getting the newly enacted ordinance in Miami-Dade County repealed. She thought gay rights was a threat. She launched a campaign called Save Our Children. and succeeded in having ordinances in Wichita and in Eugene, Oregon, and in St. Paul, Minnesota repealed. And people in Michigan were rightfully anxious that she would bring her crusade here. So people came together from around the state to form a group called the Michigan Organization for Human Rights in November 1977. First meeting in Lansing. I'll go from right to left. Sal Connor was a postal worker in Grand Rapids. Don Major had been involved in both the Gay Liberator and Metro Gay News and Gaily Speaking. Reddy Schreiber had been a member of MCC Detroit. And then on the end is Christopher Flynn, who was a dance instructor at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and had been Madonna's dance instructor and was the dance instructor who introduced her to Menjo's and the gay nightlife. So these were the founding officers of MORE, and MORE would be important because different strands would go off to form the bases of organizations that continue to today, including Affirmations Community Center in Ferndale, the Triangle Foundation, which is now Equality Michigan, and just kind of set the stage for the final enactment of protections under the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act in the state that Governor Whitmer signed in 2023. So this kind of explosion of organizations that over the decades would come into being, these all kind of owe themselves their kind of lineage to gay liberation, certainly student organizations too. So this is Grace Bacon. I'm gonna just tell you her story. She founded a group called Crossroads in Flint that was one of the earliest trans organizations. She was the one who at 12 learned about Christine Jorgensen, and when I interviewed her in 2017, she was looking forward to having affirmation surgery in her mid-70s. So she had lived her entire life kind of on this journey of self-knowledge. And that Crossroads was a precursor to Transgender Michigan, formed by Rachel Crandall, which is kind of our key trans organization. And then the student organizations that exist around the state also kind of can trace themselves all the way back. The Detroit Coalition of Black Gays was founded by Renee McCoy and Sylvia Robinson in 1979. And this kind of set the wave going for some Black specific, African American specific organizations to form. What I love about this is a flyer from the Jim Toy papers at the University of Michigan. So this is, you know, not kept very often. I like it's being held at the Metropolitan Community Church of Detroit. Why? If you have to ask, you need to come. And this organization and other organizations that would form in the 80s and 90s kind of led themselves to kind of the African American specific pride celebration of Hotter Than July that's celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. And Motor City Pride certainly traces itself. There's been a series of prides every year since 1972. And this year, you know, they're adding new prides every year. I love going to the smaller prides, my husband and I. So Flint, the Straits of Mackinac have Straits Pride, Grosse Pointe, that's really funny. And the Upper Peninsula. And Saugatuck, I mean, I think this was your second or third year of having them here. So these all kind of trace themselves back to 1972 and this era of gay liberation and promise. So, thank you.